Here we go.
Okay, so how we got, actually, I think I'm consenting to be recorded. Okay, how we got into this was I went to work for a multinational company in the late 1990s, and there were people from England, people from Germany, and people from France. And I figured that I wanted to learn soccer as a way to bridge the cultural gap. And so I bought the FIFA video game. And the internet was more in its inception, and there really weren't ways to search it. And then it was conversation, particularly around the 1998 World Cup, which France won. And then I kept at it. And then in about 2004, we took a trip, I think, to Jamaica, and we went to the game room and we saw the FIFA video game. And it intrigued us. We played it. We were horrible, even at the worst level. And then we bought it. And my joke at work was that if you couldn't achieve your goals during the day, you could come home at night and play the best team in the world against one of the worst, and on the lowest level, and you could score goals. So, you know, don't achieve goals, score goals. And you learn the game that way. It's a bit of an immersion thing. And that was a lot of our window into the game. And the kids played it in YMS. And they played in the rec league. And then, of course, the rec leagues very early on get cannibalized by all the parents who have dreams of college scholarships and money, most of which, you know, don't happen. And about 2009, the kids hadn't been abroad. And we said to them, we were getting passports to take them to Canada. And no knock, Rabbi, on Canada. But it wasn't necessarily met with overwhelming enthusiasm, although it was met with some. And then we really had planned a trip to England. And we went to Arsenal's opening match at Emirates Stadium in North London, which is a 60,000 person stadium situated in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Nobody drives. So they take the underground or they take the overland rail to get to the games. And Rusty, what was it like for you when you got there and you saw all these people, and because you were 9 at the time?
Yeah, so the store was huge. That, like, I'd seen you know, the Phillies store in Citizens Bank Park and things like that, but nothing really had compared to this. They had Arsenal Monopoly, Arsenal socks, everything you possibly could have wanted there. And then the stadium was just beautiful because it had been built in 2006. And this is actually something I would come to learn a lot about, I guess, as I got deeper into watching soccer, was the building of that stadium. But yeah, it was just so beautiful. And then the actual game itself, there's this one midfielder for Arsenal who scored 2 goals, and he was just faster than everyone else. And Arsenal won 4-1 that day and really just crushed the other team, who ended up, I think, getting relegated that year. That's terminology that we'll teach you another time. But yeah, his name was Abu Diaby, and later I found out that he could have been one of the best players in the world for his time, but he got injured too much. So it was just really cool to, like, see that. And then years later, I get really into it, and then I, like, learn about what all this means. Yeah, it was just a great experience. Hard to describe.
It was a gorgeous day, and I think that, you know, to take a page out of a different religion, a C.S. Lewis book, it was like opening the wardrobe in the Chronicles of Narnia to something totally unique. And what impressed us most, we also got the scarves. And if you ever watch a game from overseas, the fans hold up scarves and wave them. And because it was opening day, they left them on the chairs and the seats that we had. But the precision with which the players could pass the ball. The captain of Arsenal at the time was someone, if you're a soccer fan, whom you may know, named Cesc Fabregas. And he could put the ball 40 yards downfield on the right foot of, say, the left wing. And that was something, you know, having played myself in junior high school, I played what is loosely defined as center back. And my coach, Irv Nathanson, said, when you get the ball to come, you just kick it as far as you can down the field. That was, or kick it out of bounds and don't let the other team score. So that was our introduction. And then we kept on playing FIFA. And you have to forget, and you have to remember that there weren't a lot of soccer matches on TV. ESPN might have had the Champions League, which was the tournament for the best clubs in Europe. And then the World Cup would come on every 4 years, but that was it. So one of the things we wanted to say is, how did soccer become so popular in the US? And we think it's, Forbes had an article 2 years ago saying that it was the fourth most popular sport in the US, but nipping at baseball. So the first, football by far, the second, basketball, the third, baseball, the fourth, soccer, even ahead of ice hockey. And the suspicion now is that soccer has surpassed baseball, especially with what's going on now. But there's been three contributing factors to the popularity of soccer. I think one of them is, as we said, the FIFA video game is the most popular sports video game in the world, and one of the most popular video games. And the last time we checked, in the first 5 days when they come out with it in late August, it sells $5 billion worth of copies. And I guess it's gone north of there now. And a lot of kids play it, adults play it. In the NBA locker rooms, they play it. And it's become a popular culture phenomenon. And that helps also educate people about the game and teach people differences among players, because they have all the major leagues around the world, and they go down a few leagues deep, not just the best leagues in the country, and they have the international teams. The second factor is a lot of kids play it. And perhaps even in this country, the immigrant experience is different. You know, the Eastern European and European immigrants wanted to assimilate by learning baseball, but the immigration pool is a bit different now, from Central and South America, also from Africa, where soccer is big. And then I think is NBC Sports really brought the English Premier League here. I don't know how many years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And they have packages online. And if you get Fubo TV, you can get La Liga. If you have ESPN Plus, you can get the top league in Spain. And if you get Fox Sports, you can get the German league. So much now comes into the country that it's not unusual, Rusty, right? For people, you could root for the Philadelphia Union, but you might have a favorite team in a couple of the European leagues and follow them as well. And there's a lot of good material over the internet to pick up and to immerse yourself the way you'd immerse yourself in a language. You don't know a term, look it up. You want to know about a player, Google him. And so that's what we kind of did over the years to cobble together our knowledge. And don't forget, we've had to do it for the radio show and for what we do by really inventing a culture for ourselves. You know, it's one thing to say, well, yeah, my grandfather saw Babe Ruth play. Or, yeah, you remember the Eagles in the late 40s. Well, we have none of that. We don't know that history. So what we did for that was we talked to others and Googled some of the best soccer books. And I know Sandy works at an independent bookstore, but we went to Thrift Books and bought about 60 soccer books for about $250. And we're in the process of reading them all. We've read a lot of them. So that is kind of our background. And that immersion has been very key. And one of the other things is with demographics of sports fans to point out, which is the average age of a baseball fan is in his or her high 50s. And the average age of a soccer fan is much younger. And I think that bodes well for the sport, because a friend of mine once said years ago, about 15 years ago, soccer is the sport of the future in the US. And it always will be. I don't think that's true right now. But Rust, you know, for people who like start watching a game, now that we've talked about its popularity, what are some of the things to look for? The vocabulary, the English is different from the American English, and where would you go if someone's sitting next to you and they really haven't watched a match before? What would you tell them if they were sitting next to you?
Okay, so first off, they call games in England matches is the biggest thing. Then the field is called a pitch. So that's another one. That's pretty, you hear that pretty quickly whenever you watch a game. And games in the English Premier League are on tomorrow, so you guys should watch. And then the sideline is known as the touch line. The head coach is known as the manager. There's the referee, the assistant referee, also known as the linesman. Those are the ones with the flags who call offside. That's usually a pretty good way to remember who they are. And then there's also a fourth official, which is usually the person a head coach is cursing at. He's he's the guy who is on the touchline, uh, who holds up the substitution boards, and I think he is on a mic with the two assistant referees, also known as the linesman and the referee. Then in terms of positioning, there's the goalkeeper. I'm assuming you guys know what that is. The goalkeeper, there are the defenders. So usually there are 4 defenders. And in that, there are 2 center backs who are the 2 center defenders. They are like,
They're usually tall.
They're usually tall. Not the best players technically, but that's becoming less true in recent years. But what else? Yeah, so they're in the middle of defense. The outside defenders, also known as fullbacks, they go up and down the pitch on the wings. Then there's also the wings who play further forward on the side of the pitch. Then the midfield, usually 3 or 4 people in here. There's I don't know. Yeah, people always say the game's won in midfield. So
yeah,
there you go.
Let me interject there. I think they're different formations too. 11 people on a side, and there's one keeper, and the keeper can't handle the ball unless the keeper it's in a box. It's in the big goal box. If the keeper touches it outside, it's bad. The keeper might get ejected, but otherwise, no one else may use their hands except for throwing the ball in when it goes out of bounds. And except if there's a whistle, they can pick up the ball and toss it to the referee or place it for a free kick. But Russ, 90 minutes to a match, 45-minute halves. And then if the clock runs all the time. So if you're making a commitment to watching soccer with halftime and everything, it's under 2 hours and 45-minute halves. But if the action stops while the clock is running, the referee keeps track of that, and then they add on time at the end of a half, and they call that stoppage time or injury time. So the half could be 45 minutes, but say someone gets knocked unconscious and has to be stretchered off, and that takes 7 minutes. They'll add on 7 minutes, and they'll call that injury time. That can be very important because the teams that are the fittest tend to do the better late in the matches because goals can be scored late in the matches. And then when you talk, Rusty, about all those different positions, they're different formations. And when you hear numbers like a 4-4-2, it starts from the back in front of the goalie. So that would mean 4 defenders, 4 midfielders, and 2 forwards. Whereas some teams play a 3-5-2, which might be 3 defenders, 5 people in the middle of the field, and 2 forward. And different managers do different things. Now, unlike Rusty, why don't you explain the cards? Unlike the NBA when there are fouls, and unlike the NFL when there are yellow penalty flags, why don't we talk about the difference between fouls, yellow cards, and red cards?
Okay, yeah. So to start, a foul, like in, say, basketball or really any other sport, is usually, in illegal contact, like a hard tackle. A tackle is like when you try to take the ball off someone. In soccer, usually it involves sliding at their legs with your legs, or pretty much just standing up straight but kicking at the ball. So if you end up missing the ball and hit the person on purpose, etc., then you'll get called for a foul. And then depending on how bad the foul is, you can get called for a yellow card or a red card. And if you get called for 2 yellow cards, then you get sent off as you would with a red card. So a second yellow card is a red card, and a red card is also a red card.
And let me interject about that too, which is that if you get 5 cards, every time you accumulate 5 cards, you get suspended for 1 match. But if you get a straight red card, it's pretty egregious. You're suspended for 3 matches. So what's a straight red card offense could be if you slide in for a tackle. And again, a tackle in soccer, okay, is not like grabbing somebody in the NFL and throwing them to the ground. It's sliding in to take the ball away or stepping in to take the ball away. Well, if you slide in and they say studs up, which is cleats up, the cleats are metal. okay, that's a dangerous play. And usually if you go in studs up and you miss the ball and you hit someone, it's a straight red card. And there's another thing when you get a red card, and that is your team plays a person down. So we have seen matches where teams play 2 or 3 people down because of the number of red cards in the matches. It's rare. Playing one person down, though, is not rare. And it can really change the game, either because your opponent is so good they'll just run right over you and take advantage, or because the team that goes a person down does something called parking the bus. They put all the players near in the half of the field where they're defending the goal, and they make it virtually impossible to try to penetrate that defense to score. It's a pretty good way of controlling the game and keeping the guys from fighting. And of course, if you raise fists or you do something like that, it's pretty much a straight red card. Sometimes they push and they lose their temper, but the referee's job isn't really to throw people out of the game, but the card concept polices the game. And then, Rusty, if there is something the most controversial thing, why don't we discuss that, which is the dreaded VAR. If you watched a game, you're going to hear this. The VAR is something that is as controversial a topic as any there is in sport.
Right. So VAR is video assistant referee. So it hasn't been a thing in soccer until, I believe, 2018 or 2019. So it's very recent, and it's been highly debated because people don't think that the game should be mechanized. They think that human imperfection is what makes it so entertaining. But video assistant referee is basically an instant replay thing where referees can consult it for goals and fouls, I believe. Pretty much just goals and fouls, and or goals and possible red cards. So they can consult it. You can either listen to an assistant official on your headset, or you can go to an actual screen on the side of the field and check it out. And yeah, basically, some people think it's a route into the game having commercials. Others think it's just a good way to provide fairness. So essentially, that's it. It's really controversial, though, for the purists.
It's a good thing, I think, because there's so much money bet on soccer internationally, and particularly in cup games or in international games, that it really takes away some of the elements that used to happen where referees would get bribed, and which still remains a possibility because the betting numbers, particularly from Asia, where there are big betting cultures and syndicates, can be staggering. And this way, if somebody got to a referee and the referee ruled a goal offside, the VAR would say, no, wait a second, take a look at it. Now, it removes the spontaneity, because what happens is a team will score a goal and everybody starts cheering, and then they all stop celebrating and they look up to make sure that the referee isn't going to look at VAR to take the goal away. But one of the issues really is not so much with VAR, but the offside rule, which right now reads that if you're a fingernail offside, the goal will be disallowed. And there's some discussion about making that rule not as dramatic, so that the spirit of the law will work. But if you're only slightly offside, and of course it's hard to define an adverb, it could be more palatable to the fans. But just to give you an idea of how much effort goes into that video assisted refereeing, when the Bundesliga resumed play, in a typical display of German engineering, they decided that only 322 people were permitted to be in a stadium. And of those, about 50 of them were VAR technicians and cameramen and people to get all the angles right, in addition to the players and the trainers and the referees. So a few more things to talk about the rules are there are only 3 substitutes per team per match. So you have to be careful when you substitute, because if you substitute pretty quickly and then somebody gets hurt and can't continue, then you're playing a person down. And typically, unless someone's very ineffective, typically teams tend to substitute pretty much 2/3 of the way into the match. And sometimes it depends upon how fit somebody is, what the next match is. Do they want to get a younger player in?
Also, by the way, for, I don't know how long it's going to be going on for, but for the next few weeks or months, FIFA, which is the highest governing body in soccer, they're allowing 5 substitutes per match, since the players are more at risk to getting injured since they weren't playing most of the time during the pandemic. So just
That,
wanted
that
to let you know.
No, that's a great point. And the injury rate since the pandemic has been 3 times the normal, because while they could drop off stationary bikes and treadmills and stretch bands and some weights to the players' houses, the lateral movements that they do, they really haven't been able to practice. And we have seen that in the Bundesliga with players going off and reading injury reports, because the Bundesliga, the German league, came back 5 weeks ago and was the first league to do it. A couple of things you might say, well, what about penalties in soccer, and when do they come in? And we'll say this, which is in that big box near the goal, not the little box, but the really big box. If a player is fouled in that box while on offense, then it doesn't have to be a yellow card or a red card. It might be, but then it's a penalty shot. And that's the easiest way to score a goal. It's 75% of the time the ball does go in. But usually a team has a designated taker, and that's preordained before the match, as the person who has nerves of steel and who also is good at kicking the ball in the back of the net. And then you're also going to hear these terms if you watch the game, called set pieces or free kicks. For instance, if a player comes in late on a tackle and it's a foul, that'll be a free kick, and usually teams, Rusty, try to take them right away. And then if the defensive team kicks the ball over the end line, that is over the line near the goal it's defending, it's a corner kick for its opponent, where they put the ball in the corner and they try to loop it in toward the goal, and everybody forms like an upright scrum, and the offense tries to head the ball into the goal, and you hope there's enough chaos if you're on offense that the ball either goes in or comes to somebody's feet and they can kick it in. But that's a corner kick, but they also call the free kicks, where you can kick the ball without anybody trying to kick you, set pieces. And those are obviously good to have. So with that, Russ, why don't we talk a little bit about tactics? Because you might think that the ball just goes on the field, the referee blows the whistle, but there are different styles of play. And really right now, there are 2 main ones that we see in the major leagues. And why don't you talk about the Jurgen Klopp school and the Jose Mourinho school, and they're 2 of the best coaches in the world.
All right. So this is kind of, I guess, high-minded sort of soccer talk, because it is sort of advanced and not necessarily when you're first introduced to it. It's not necessarily the first thing you think about, but it does help you in enjoying watching the game. If you know how teams are playing, it can help you learn to pick a team depending on what you want to see every game. But really the 2 different types of tactics that are used are pressing and then counterattacking. So there are lots of variations in both of these. There are different formations you can use, different types of players, etc. So with high pressing, that's a more offensive style of play. So what happens is you're basically trying to control the ball most of the time, and then when you lose the ball, your team is going to press the other team as hard as they can to try and win it back for a few seconds, and pretty much just trying to maintain high intensity. Usually the best teams play this way because they have the fittest players and the best players, so they can run the longest and and keep the ball the best and all of that. Then there's parking the bus or counterattacking. So I guess we'll call it counterattacking. That's the nice way to put it, because it implies that there is an offensive strategy, whereas parking the bus is just keep all 11 players in front of the ball and hope that the other team can't get through. But counterattacking is usually sitting on the back foot and defending, but you have to maintain your concentration if you're a defender here because you're going to be doing your job for most of the 90 minutes. But then the goal is to, when you get a chance and the other team commits too far forward, you get the ball past them and have your forwards run it down and, score if they can. And usually there's only a couple offensive chances per game if you're using that style of play, depending on, your team's talent level and things like that. But if they do it well, then it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, Russ, just jumping in there too. High pressing is like the full court press in basketball, to use an analogy, where you're really trying to cause the other team to make mistakes because it's pretty easy, or it's easier to score in transition when the other team's defense isn't set. Now, if you're playing a counterattacking style, you're going to cede possession in the game to the other team, and possession numbers can be misleading. So you could win the game 1-0 and only have possession for 32% of the minutes. But the reason is that the other team's trying to get in, and then you launch a counterattack and you try to catch them when their defense isn't set. Now, one thing to clarify from what Rusty said is you're catching the other team off guard, because we haven't discussed the offside rule. And the offside rule in a nutshell is that you can't, your players can't run by the last defender other than the goalie. They're offside, okay, even if they're a fingernail by them. So they need to time their runs so that when the pass starts on a counterattack, they're onside. And then once they can sense that, they can run like heck and run past the defender and score. But the measuring stick will be, when that pass started, was the attacker even with the defense? And that's where this whole VAR system comes into play, and where some of the biggest controversies happen. But typically you can see some teams win with 20, we've seen it with 25%. The other team gets 15 shots and the winning team gets one, but it's the right one. And typically teams that aren't the big spenders and aren't the household names in the world, for the most part, use that because they can't run with the elite teams that spend all the money. So turning now to the best leagues in the world, because you'll hear things, you'll see advertisements. The best league in the world is the English Premier League. If for no other reason than the wage bills in the English Premier League are the highest, but top to bottom on any given Saturday or Sunday, the worst team can beat the best team. And it's happened a couple of times this year. Norwich beat Manchester City when they were in last place. And when Watford was in 19th out of 20th, Watford beat Liverpool and ended Liverpool's storied unbeaten streak. And teams have only gone undefeated twice in the English Premier League, once in the 1890s and once 16 years ago. So it's very, very rare. But the Premier League is just terrific. It's a bit of haves and have-nots. There's 6 teams that are called the Big Six, and it's Liverpool, which did a lot of damage in the 70s and 80s and won everything. Hasn't won a title in 30 years, but could clinch its first title in 30 years on Sunday. And then there are the 2 teams in Manchester United and Manchester City. There are the London teams. There are 3 teams in London: Arsenal, Tottenham, and Chelsea. And the English Premier League's popularity in this country is such that on any given weekend there are bars and cities full of fans from different teams, including some of the lesser teams. The German league is called the Bundesliga. The English Premier League is a bit of a chess match. There's a lot of strategy and in it. The Bundesliga is more run and gun, and the players tend to be younger. One of the best young players in England just signed with one of the best clubs in Germany. It's a good way for players to develop before they go on to, say, the Spanish league, the 2 top clubs in the Spanish league, or the top 6 or 7 in the English Premier League. And Bayern Munich is, Russ, the big squad there. And they've just won it today for the 8th year in a row. And they're one of the best clubs in the world. So, Russ, why don't you tell everybody about the Spanish league and the Italian league, and then I'll talk about some of the others.
Sure. So the Spanish league is called La Liga. It has arguably the 2 best teams in the world in it, Real Madrid and FC Barcelona. They've become known since pretty much the 2000s or so. Spain in general for being great passers, and they play really attractive soccer, as the experts tend to say. And so Barcelona, they have Lionel, which I've heard of. He's if you haven't, he is the best player in the world right now, probably
Let's
the
stop
best
there.
player ever.
You got cut off. Lionel Messi.
Yeah, Lionel
Right.
Messi.
Yeah.
Very good. He's a very good player. And then there's Real Madrid, who used to have Cristiano Ronaldo, who is probably the second best player in the world. And they have a lot of money and used to be the dictator's favorite team. And yeah, they're both those teams are always fun to watch. I mean, they have a lot of talent. And also in that league, there are a few other clubs who are decent. There's Atletico Madrid, who recently won La Liga, which rarely happens. It rarely happens that a team that's not Real Madrid or FC Barcelona win it. So that's a pretty unbalanced league. A lot of them are kind of having that issue of becoming, pretty top heavy. Speaking of top heavy, we can go to Ligue 1 in France, where I believe from like 2003 to 2008, Olympique Lyon won something like 7 or 8 straight league championships. Then pretty much every team won it between the end of Lyon's streak and about 2013. Then since 2013, Paris Saint-Germain, which is the biggest team in Paris, they've won it for like 7 years in a row. Not really a lot going on there other than Kylian Mbappe and Neymar, who are two of the best players in the world. And then Serie A, historically, it's known for very defensive soccer. And in the 1990s, it was probably for a time the best league in the world. But yeah, now
into the 2000s.
Yeah, into the 2000s. And I mean, now it's still known for defensive soccer. It has some very good players. The total quality of play isn't necessarily as high as the Premier League, but it's still pretty entertaining if you watch the big teams, which are Juventus, Inter Milan, historically AC Milan, not so much right now, and Roma. So yeah, those are the top 5 leagues.
Yeah, they are, and there's some debate. Some of the experts have posited that the Ukrainian league, with a few good teams, is maybe the next one. The Dutch league is very good, and you'll ask, where does Major League Soccer fit in? And in our talking on our show with various soccer writers, they're probably could an MLS team compete at the bottom of the Premier League? Maybe, but the second league down in England, called the English Championship League, is more along the speed of MLS. Some MLS teams are a lot better than other, but MLS has a salary cap. It has a complicated salary formula. Maybe the teams spend $9 million a year on salaries. And if you just want to contrast that to Liverpool and Manchester City's, their wage bills annually are about $300 million. So while excellence isn't always necessarily bought, it has to be paid for. And that's how they do it. Rusty, I want to just touch on one topic before opening it up for questions. And this is something that is far different in global soccer from anything in U.S. sports, was just the idea of promotion and relegation. And we'll take England as an example. In the English league, there are 20 teams in the Premier League. In the Championship League, the next league down, has 24 teams. So in the Premier League, the top 17 teams stay, and the bottom 15%, the bottom 3 teams, get sent down or relegated to the Championship League, and the top 3 teams in the Championship League get promoted, and this cascades down all through the English leagues. So for example, in the Championship League, it's really worth about £200 million if you get promoted because of all the TV money in England. And the top 2 teams in the Championship League get automatically promoted. And the third team, there's a 4-team playoff, and they joke that the final playoff match to get that third spot is the most lucrative match in all of global soccer, because if you win that match, you'll get the extra £200 million in television money. So with that, there are many other issues. There's international play, with the World Cup every 4 years, and the usual suspects. Historically, Brazil, Germany, France, England, Portugal, Spain are very good, and of course, on the women's side, the U.S. Is preeminent. So with that, why don't we stop there, because I had a message or two. If people have any questions or anything they'd like to debate or discuss.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about my own history with football, because it goes way back to the late 70s and early 80s. I was a fan of the Cosmos, the New York Cosmos, with Giorgio Canaglia and Pele. And to a large extent, I courted my wife by going to Giant Stadium and watching Cosmos games with her. And we came back to soccer in the mid-2000s, as you were talking about, as our son started to play FIFA. And he loved it, and he decided he needed to have a team to root for. And I suggest this also for new fans. Find a team to root for. That way you'll learn their players, you'll have a rooting interest. It's a lot more fun. Unfortunately, the team my kid chose was West Ham United, who, again, are in a battle this year to survive relegation, which, if you've never been involved with soccer, the idea of relegation is so awful. You're rooting for your team even more at the bottom of the table than you may even be rooting for them at the top of the table, which really makes soccer wonderful. Every single game matters. And I can't wait until tomorrow when the Premier League restarts. I can't wait till Saturday when my team plays. 12:30, NBC, Channel 10, be there. And we'll see how they do, but it's so much fun. So if you're new to it, if you're new to soccer, find a team, pick a team, and you have a chance to watch them all the time. It's fantastic.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that's the way it's, for instance, suppose you were recommending someone who's learning a language. I know Hannah Greenberg is going to be going to Israel and knows a lot of Hebrew, but the best way to learn it conversationally is to parachute in. And this is a way to do it, I think, is the announcers are pretty good, and you listen, and if you don't know something, you can look it up. And if you follow a team, it's a good way to immerse yourself. I mean, we picked Arsenal because I did business with a company in London in the late 90s, and Arsenal had a hot hand. And so when we looked for tickets in 2009, I picked Arsenal. Now, the interesting thing is Arsenal has a lot of Jewish fans, but Tottenham is one of the clubs in the world that probably has the most Jewish fans, and particularly in England.
True.
And Rusty and I sometimes debate that. And then the Ajax club, which is the best team in the Netherlands, sometimes flies the Israeli flag because one of their formative, in their formative years, one of their beloved players and managers was Jewish and perished in the Holocaust. And then during, in Bayern Munich, which is one of the best clubs in the world, also has some prominent Jewish people in the club's history, and that gets touted too. And how you pick a club can be a little bit by accident too. Right now, there is a Russian Jew, an oligarch named Roman Abramovich, who, among other things, was like the governor of Western Siberia and helped bail it out economically and was beloved there. But he took his money and bought Chelsea. And Rusty and I are smacking our heads because we wish he had bought Arsenal, because money seems to be no object with him. And they're in Southwest London. And if you look at London like a rectangle, 6 of the 20 Premier League teams are there. But that's the way you do it. You pick a club and their rivalries, and they call them derbies, even though it's derby. So Arsenal, Tottenham are arch rivals. Rusty and I have been to a North London derby. It's pretty intense. The clubs in Manchester rivals, but Manchester United and Liverpool were big rivals, and they call those derbies as well. And it's fun to hear the chants. They're usually, unlike in international matches, they're usually more funny or passionate than they are profane or insulting. And there's a lot of good stuff there. We've been to Emirates Stadium 5 times. We've been to Barcelona to 2 different stadiums. And then 2 summers ago, we went to Moscow and we watched the World Cup. And Rust, what were your impressions, being there with fans from all over the world? Because I think it's good to share the flavor of how important and how meaningful soccer is.
Yeah, everyone was in a really good mood, which was great. Like people, fans from, say, Poland and Senegal. We went to a Poland versus Senegal game. They were taking photos with each other, and they were like singing together and things like that. And everyone was just really happy to be there more than they were angry about their team losing or anything like that. It was just really nice to see so many people of so many different cultures coming together. And that was really beautiful. And then it was just, the best soccer in the world, which you can never complain about. And yeah, it was just a great time.
We picked a team too, because we didn't have one because the U.S. men weren't there.
Don't even get me started on that.
Yeah, well, we suffered watching them lose them, tantamount to a high school field in Trinidad. They needed to beat the Trinidadians, and they went down 2-0 in the first half and lost and didn't qualify. So we picked Belgium because Belgium is a 15 million person country, and they're a bit like the Greatest Show on Turf. They were like the English Premier League All-Stars, and they got pretty far. They lost to France in the semifinals, and France was pretty much the favorite to win it all. There's one documentary, a couple of documentaries if you get Amazon Prime that we would recommend. One is a 6-part documentary called This is Football. And it's not about the history of the game or Real Madrid or anything. It's about the importance of soccer around the world, from Rwandans who's holding on to Liverpool during the genocide, helped them stay emotionally strong, to a young woman in India who, for her, soccer was everything and her ticket out. And it's very powerful, and it would be, say, 5.5 hours well spent. And then on our show, we had the director and one of the producers of a documentary called Matthews, about Sir Stanley Matthews, who was one of probably the first superstar in English football in the 30s, where his career was cut short by World War II, but he played until he was 50 years old, and was a vegetarian and didn't drink and went through rigorous training methods. It was way before his time. And then at the end of the career, he did wonderful things in South Africa. And that's about an hour and a half, also on Prime, and was really worthwhile. And then, as I was talking before we started, I happened to find there's a podcast called Forgotten Stories of Football. And there's a wonderful story about an Israeli referee named Abraham Klein. It's in 2 parts about how he became to be known as the best referee in the world. And he reffed in a lot of key matches, but also because he was Israeli, was precluded from reffing in some key matches. And if you go wherever you get your podcasts, this just started. It's by The Guardian out of England. And there are 2 wonderful podcasts about Abraham Klein. And as for, a couple other Jewish connections, sadly, Israel falls victim to international politics when it comes to international club play, and that they're included in Europe because the Arab countries refuse to play them, which means their qualifying path to the World Cup is much more difficult. They'd have a good shot against, although Morocco is very good, and they were probably, Rusty, one of the best teams from the Middle East. Their chances against the Tunisias and Moroccos would be much better than going up in groups where they have to play against the European powers. And as for outstanding Israeli players, the best one in recent memory was a guy named Yossi Benayoun, who spent time with some of the major European clubs, including Chelsea and Arsenal. And now I think he's close to retirement and back in Israel. Tal Ben-Haim, Mitch, I think actually played for West Ham. And then there was an Israeli coach, Avram Grant.
I think Yossi Benayoun also played for West Ham.
Yeah, he might have. And then Avram Grant managed West Ham at one point. And
Don't talk about that.
You don't like him?
Oh, they were relegated with him. He was awful.
That's true. He looked very unhappy on the bench when we watched him manage. It looked like a big burden, but and the Israeli league, is certainly competitive. There are two tiers there, and Maccabi Tel Aviv, as in basketball, is one of the best clubs. And then there have been U.S. players over the years who were Jewish as well, too. And for the U.S. women, they kind of created a culture of international women's soccer and therefore helped build it. There were some pockets in Brazil and in Western Europe, but they really did. And for access, two of the biggest sports for women in the U.S. are soccer and basketball as team sports, whereas the men are still playing catch up with the international game. It's hard to create a culture. We have a pay-to-play culture here that focuses more on suburbs than the inner city. And to me, it's hard for kids from Yardley and from Short Hills, New Jersey, and from Creve Coeur, Missouri, and Los Altos Hills to compete against the kids from the favelas in Brazil who are playing in fenced-in courts, or the kids from Paris, the immigrant kids who play in the banlieues in suburban Paris, where they're playing in small courts and cages, and they really learn spontaneity and decision-making as opposed to have adults yelling at them all the time. And I think for the US, a lot of our better youngsters are playing in Europe, and a lot of them are playing in Germany. And the reason they play in Germany is because Germany's immigration laws for players are among the least restrictive compared to, say, England, where for their academies and their youth programs, it's almost exclusively English kids. But there are a lot of teenagers and players in their early 20s playing all over the Bundesliga in Germany. And that gives the US some hope for the future, that maybe they can do a run more deeply into the World Cup. And while soccer is among the most, it might be the most popular sport in the world, when you look at the 5 most populous countries, it isn't. Basketball is more popular in China. Cricket's more popular in India. Okay, cricket's more popular in Pakistan. I don't know what's the most popular in Indonesia. And then you get to the US, which is American football. And when you add up all that population, okay, you're talking 1.2 million, 1.1 million, and then say 450 million apiece, right? So you're talking 3.2 million right there, plus another 300 million, almost half the world's population in those countries. It's not the most popular sport, but it is pretty much everywhere else. And so we could go on for longer, but it's been about 45 minutes. And if anybody has any questions at all, you certainly can email us. Brazil is densely populated too, but they are they're after Russia, I think. So they might be the 7th most. So Russia, it could be the most popular sport, and then Brazil. But among the top 5, it isn't. So if anybody has any more questions, please fire away. Linda.
Yeah. So Rich, I have a question, because I'm not a big soccer watcher, but a couple years ago there was the big scandal about where the World Cup and all the bribery. Do you think that had an impact at all? And you talked about the Russian oligarch with all the money. Do you think that the people who have money are tainting it at all?
2 different questions. The answer is this. Rusty came home from school years ago and he said, "Hey, Dad, did you hear that the 2018 World Cup's going to Russia and the 2022 World Cup is going to Qatar?" And my reflex reaction, of which I was not proud, was, "Oh, they must have bribed somebody." Well, it turns out they did. It turns out that the Russians bribed, it's one country, one vote in FIFA, which is the international soccer governing body. And the Russians bribed all these small countries within these federations because England thought they had it, because England has all the stadiums, all the infrastructure, and the Russians took it. And then FIFA tries to spread it around the world, and the Qataris, this guy, Mohammed bin Hamad, who was kind of in the shadows but close to the emir who, Qatar is basically a family business that has a seat at the UN table. It has 300,000 people. Almost nobody works because they import the people to work. It has a huge obesity rate, and don't get me started with them, but they did it too. And there's some good books about that. London Times reporters wrote that, and I think that that's why they had to move the World Cup back from the summer. Obviously, it had to be bribery. Who would agree to put the World Cup in the middle of the desert in July? I mean, where the average temperature was 122 degrees. So now they moved it back to November, where it'll be average temperature about 85 degrees. And when the head of FIFA at the time, Sepp Blatter, heard about it, he wanted to take it out of Qatar. He was horrified. He was older. He didn't realize all this went on, and he tried to do it. But the Qataris threatened to back a candidate from Malaysia when Blatter was up for re-election, and Blatter thought he wasn't going to get re-elected. And so Blatter backed off and let it stay in Qatar. And then the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York indicted all these people involved with the bribery, but FIFA's still sticking by the Qatar decision, and we think it's just a big mistake to do that. And then with the money, it is interesting because there is a bit of the haves and the have-nots. And what we're worried about, Rusty and I talked about this on the show today, is that you're going to, right now they're the big six in the Premier League, and everybody else, although Wolverhampton and Leicester are doing well now, and Sheffield United, everybody else is really playing to stay up and not to win it. In France before the season, now they joke because an oil emir owns Paris Saint-Germain, is who's going to finish in second. And so there's something called financial fair play, which was supposed to rein in excessive spending. It really hasn't. But that has been a problem, Linda, but also a problem, I think, right now is the soccer economy is devastated. It's 2% of the GDP in Spain, and the lower level teams in France, 17 of the 20 teams in the top league will need government bailouts to stay alive. And then in England, because most of the lower league teams get their revenue from game day revenue from merchandise sales and tickets and concessions, they might need bridge loans until it's safe to go back into the stadium. So, Russ, what are your thoughts about the pay to play, the pay disparity and the wage disparity in global soccer?
So you've used the phrase arms race before, and I think that's pretty accurate because the fees paid for players are just becoming exorbitant, especially for pretty average players. Especially in England because of the huge TV deal. So everyone is just trying to keep up with the team ahead of them and trying to stay in the Premier League because everyone in the Premier League gets like close to $200 million per season from TV money. And that's not even
Rose up a little bit.
What'd you say?
Oh, you broke up a little bit.
So yeah, big transfer fees, average players, and yeah, it's just all about trying to stay in the Premier League. And a lot of teams in the lower leagues especially, or towards the bottom of the Premier League, might gamble and pay more than they can in the hopes that they'll either get promoted to the Premier League or in the hopes that they'll stay in the Premier League, and then if that doesn't pay off, then you're going to go into debt, and so on and so forth. So it's really making I guess the term is minnows, smaller clubs in the biggest leagues kind of either outspend themselves or outspend like what they can, or fall into obscurity. It's kind of wild, but I root for Arsenal, so I'm not really faced with that. So this is my first time ever kind of considering that, because the Premier League was apparently created to benefit the biggest 6 teams that already really had, I guess, the closest thing to global brands that soccer teams could be before the Premier League. So,
and the creation of the Premier League 25 years ago really exploded the TV money beyond belief. I mean, and the sponsorships. Manchester United has 60 regional sponsors that pay in billions of dollars. So the money is preposterous. But the problem for smaller teams is Bournemouth was 3 leagues down years ago and got promoted about 6 years ago. Now, Bournemouth is a town on the southeast coast of England. Its stadium seats 12,000 people. Bournemouth spends 85% of its revenue on wages, and it's just not sustainable when you compare it to some of the other places. So then it's a big issue. I mean, and Major League Baseball tried the luxury tax so that a Kansas City could win the World Series, because otherwise, you were looking at the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Boston Red Sox, even the Chicago Cubs, which finally broke their streak. And I think that's where the NFL gets it right. Because on any given year, I see the Cubs mug with the rabbi. At any given year, a different team can win.
Can I switch topics for 1 second and ask you a different question? What do you think? What do you think of Greg Berhalter?
that's a good question.
Let Rusty go on that. Well, we think U.S. soccer's a mess, but Rusty, why don't you give your view?
I think that I'm not a fan of the whole. I'm not a fan of nepotism. I'll put it that way, because I know Jay Berhalter, which is Greg Berhalter's brother, was an executive in U.S. soccer before he stepped down recently with the whole equal pay lawsuit going on. And Greg Berhalter, the coach of the United States men's national team, he was appointed head coach, I believe, while Jay was still there. He's been the head coach for a while. I think that the U.S. men's national team probably needs to go with a foreign coach, because I think that in terms of U.S. coaches, if you're not getting Jesse Marsh, and Jesse Marsh is probably the best American coach. For those who don't know, he coaches Red Bull Salzburg in Austria, and we had him on the show recently, so you guys can listen to us there. But anyway, I think that with the expectations the fans have and with the talent in the squad, because it's not a bad team on paper, I think that they need to find someone who can get the most out of the team. And since the best players on the team are already playing in Europe anyway, I don't think that it would be a bad thing to have probably someone from Europe would end up being a good.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, because when they hired Jurgen Klinsmann, they thought they had this innovator, and it was a well-intentioned hire, and it ended disastrously. And Klinsmann since recently joined Hertha Berlin, and then quit or was fired about 6 weeks later. He's become increasingly impossible. But Germany had to transform its culture in the early 2000s, getting ready for the World Cup they were hosting in 2004. They played a very defensive style. They had a 4 defenders and somebody called a sweeper. And the sweepers in German history were among the most noted players. Franz Beckenbauer, I think Lothar Matthäus, maybe 2, Rusty, I'm not sure. And then they needed to change the way they trained, change how they developed kids in the academies. And Klinsmann came over from the US and brought all these kind of nouveau eating and sleeping and training and measurement methods. And the Germans really glommed onto it to the point where they won the World Cup in stunning fashion in 2010. And continue now to develop good players. But I think the jury's still out. Put it this way, it's like anything else. You can have a great coach and talent, and you can have an coach and wonderful talent, and I'll bet on the coach anytime. And when I look at the U.S., we've been good at developing goalkeepers. And the goalkeeper, if it's not Brad Guzan, it'll be Zach Steffen, who plays at Eintracht Frankfurt, but has been offered to be the backup at Manchester City next year. I don't think our defenders are particularly stellar. John Brooks, who plays at Hertha Berlin in Germany.
Wolfsburg.
Or Wolfsburg now, where Volkswagen is the best. I think that, the best players we have are Christian Pulisic, who plays at Chelsea, Weston McKennie, who plays for Schalke, and Gio Reyna, Claudio Reyna's son, who plays for Borussia Dortmund. And there are others sprinkled throughout Germany, but we don't have enough. And I think for a nation of 320 million people, until our best 100 or 200 players are playing in Europe, and a lot of them are playing meaningful roles on good teams, we're not going to maybe get past the round of 16, and the round of 8, I think, would be a huge win at the next World Cup. Because when you look at Belgium, a nation of 15 million people, and you looked at who was on their team in 2018, their goalie was Chelsea's starting goalie. Their 3 fullbacks were the captain for Manchester City and the 2 center backs for Tottenham, who were viewed as the 2 best center backs in the world. Their defensive midfielder is one of the stars of Borussia Dortmund. Their striker was on Manchester United, and this is a country of 15 million people. And it was an all-star team, and they were great. And boy, could they move down the field. And, the U.S. is 22 times the size of Belgium, and nowhere near the quality, because our best athletes still are going into basketball and football. So I'll give him a shot. It's been mixed. They haven't done great under him, but we'll see.
Thank you. Appreciate the answer. We have our doubts about Greg. When he was a kind of a so-so defender for the U.S. national team. So our memories go way back, and we were not impressed with him back then either. But
We'll say this to you about so-so defenders. Jurgen Klopp, who is a very charismatic guy, and you're going to know the names of 2 managers of soccer teams. One is Jurgen Klopp, who coaches Liverpool, and the other one is Pep Guardiola, who coaches Manchester City. Pep was a great player, for sure, for Barcelona. But Klopp played for Mainz in the German league. And at the time, Mainz was a 2nd division club. And he was a striker who had a lot of energy, but apparently couldn't always get there. And he turned out to be a wonderful coach, first starting at Mainz and then moving over to Borussia Dortmund in the early 2010 decade. So, it could well be that he can see more than he can actually do physically. We thought it was a curious choice. We thought they might have gone back to Bob Bradley after his stint with the Egyptians. We didn't want them to go back to Bruce Arena. And just to say about U.S. soccer, it's a horrible political mess right now. They have the upper hand in the lawsuit, but in litigation, I don't always think everybody wins. The women's team's unhappy. And who knows how much money U.S. soccer has. Their whole management structure is a mess. It's very political. And, they have to straighten that out. But they're not all that different from a lot of national soccer federations. But it's the women play with a chip on their shoulder, and part of what fuels them is that they hate the U.S. Soccer Federation. And Rusty and I joked on the air that if they ever get peace, will they lose their impetus to be as great as they are? We think they're pros, they'll do fine. But with the men, it's one of these things where, they have a long way to go to catch up, I think, culturally with some of the powers that have won all the World Cups.
Well, Cindy Paulo is now the new head of U.S. soccer, so maybe that will help.
It should. I think the issue is, having managed litigation in my career, a lot of people who end up in litigation want to make a deal, but there are occasions where you run into the true believers who make public statements that are hard to come back from. And I think that's what the dynamic is. They got a very favorable ruling on a motion for summary judgment, did U.S. soccer, but the women are pretty dug in. And if they probably will feel it's a humiliation if they accept anything other than what they demanded publicly, which A, I'm not so sure U.S. soccer has the money to pay it, especially in one fell swoop. And B, given how the judge narrowed the scope for damages, right now, the way the case is trending, they don't. The only people making money right now are the lawyers for both sides. So it's a shame that there isn't someone who's an eminence grise of type who can go in and settle it. My view is Barack Obama might be that person. I don't know if anybody else could be, because it's just such a Gordian knot and hard to extricate from. Too. So they have, and Cindy Parlow Cohn is a good person. So is Kate Margraf, who's the general manager of the women's team. But it's complicated, and it's just real complicated. So we've been on for about an hour and say 6 minutes, and we pretty much, I think, we had a bunch of things, but the key thing is start watching. That would be our suggestion. I mean, Rusty, you watch everybody. I even watched the Danish league the other day because I was bored. I wouldn't recommend that. It wasn't very good, but it was on.
Do you watch MLS?
We do. We have a good relationship with the union. They have a communications person. We've had Jim Curtin on, and Brendan Aronson, and Jack Elliott, and
Matt Freese,
the backup goalie, and we're trying to get Ray Gaddis, who's been with them for a while, for next week's show. And we've been there, and we watch them, and we watch the playoffs for sure. So we do that because it's good to support your local team. And we do watch the Premier League, and because the Bundesliga was the first back, we'll watch that. And then we'll pop into the other leagues. We don't have, unless the free Mexican channels on our cable package have the Spanish league, we don't get it. And we're going to probably remedy that in the upcoming year. And we also try to be people of multiple interests. So there's so much soccer we can watch a week.
Well, thank you so much, Rich and Rusty. You guys are real Renaissance men. And this was a real tour de force. I certainly learned a tremendous amount about soccer now. You've piqued my interest, so I want to dive in. But I'm going to turn it over to our adult ed chair, Helene, who has admitted to me that she herself is something of a soccer buff. So here we go.
I'm a long-time soccer fan, and I was thrilled that you were doing this. It's indeed a passion of mine as well, but thank you for sharing your passion. And also, before anybody leaves, just so you know, Rusty and Rich have a show on Tuesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daylight Time, on 610 ESPN. So tune in.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, we welcome all the listeners, and sometimes we even take callers. But we had a lot of ground to cover today, and it was great to be back in the studio and to see a town other than Yardley.
Well, thank you so much once again. And tune in here in a couple of weeks. I believe our next passion is going to be Jake Willerstein, and we'll be talking about gardening. So come and share. And if you have passions to share, we would very much like to hear about them, and we'll put you on. You'll be a star.
Tremendous. Well, thanks for the invitation, Rabbi and Helene, and we greatly appreciate it. It's been a busy soccer day for us, and then we get to watch tomorrow. And Mitch, best of luck with West Ham.
It's hopeless.
You're gonna need it.
I think you'll be okay.
Everybody. Thank you very much for that.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much, Rich and Rusty.
Hey,
Thank
Rich,
you.
what kind of audience do you get on your show? Do you know?
We don't. We have to do a better job at the stadium to get a sense of the station to get a sense of that, but we don't know. We know we have some, and the show repeats the following day, and we're available in the net. So that's a good question, and we have to find out. Now that more people are back to work in the station, we can dig in on that.
I'm definitely tune in. I'm interested to hear it. So cool.
Well, we had a lot of energy today.
Cool. Thanks, Gorelick. Really appreciate it. This was fun.
Thank you.
Hey, quite welcome. Have a good night, everybody.
Nice, thank you.
Night.
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 Have a good night.